It's very interesting to look back in history again, when we consider heat treatment, to see what some of the early products were that man made out of steel and steel products. One of the most fascinating ones, I think, to look at is the ability that early man developed in forging together, or causing to weld together two small particles of iron-based material. Say pure iron, it was sponge iron. When he did this, he always had to heat the material up to get it to weld together. When he heated it up, he had to use a carbonaceous fire, and so he had absorbed on the surface of the material some carbon. I think it's kind of easy to see why they call the material Fe3C cementite, because we're always involved in the formation of the carbon on the surface. But as he built the structure up, he got a larger and larger piece, which he could fold back on itself if you wanted to and keep hammering it out. And what he got was layers of a very hard material, which was the iron carbide or the steel type material, and a layer of almost pure iron or ferrite. And he continued to do this until he got a block big enough, and when he got the block big enough, he would forge it into, let's say, a sword, or he would grind the shape into a sword. And when he looked at these layers on the polished or the prepared surface, he would find a wavy layered structure that he had mechanically developed into the particular alloy he had. He polished the material, and then he was interested in making it pretty, and he found out that he could do something with it, like put it in waters that had been prepared. Remember, now we're not in the days of being able to order up any acid you want, so he was making acid by soaking various vegetation in water, oak leaves in water and whatnot. And when he did this, he got a watermark on the materials, where we get watermark from. First watermarks weren't in paper. The first watermarks apparently were in metallic structures. And if you looked at this watermark, you'd find it was a Ripley type structure that went through the steel. This is Damascus steel I'm describing to you. And that Damascus steel with that particularly unusual wavy structure impressed enough people so that today we have a material, a textile material that we refer to as damask, but it means that it has a structure or a texture like Damascus steel. So we find out that these old-timers really had the capability of doing some sort of a surface preparation that enabled them to have an unusual material. I have a lot of fun with this because if you do metallurgy by barroom antics, you can find that you can always win a free beer with this one. If you ask somebody if he believes it's possible for you to tie a cigarette in a knot and then untie it and that it would still be in a condition for him to smoke, I think most anybody would say, no, you can't do that. Well, if you wanted to do it, what you do is take the cellophane from the pack of cigarettes and roll the cigarette tightly in the cellophane, and then take the cellophane, a tube that you have with the cigarette inside, and tie it in a knot. So since the cellophane's tied in a knot, the cigarette's tied in a knot. Then you can untie it and extract the cigarette, and it's still quite smokable, and you will not have broken it all to pieces. Now what have you really done? You put a very tough material next to a very brittle material, right? The cigarette being a brittle material, and found out you have the capability of generating a whole new set of properties by this surface treatment you got. Just stop for a moment and reflect on this business of steel now, where we have eutectoidal steels, which in microstructure are described as layers of ferrite, a very ductile, tough, soft material, and a layer of cementite, which is a very hard, brittle material, on a microscopic scale. So we have hard, tough, hard, tough, hard, tough. It's just like the cigarette wrapped up in the cellophane. So it behooves us perhaps to look at more gross structures, let's say devices that we want to make, and consider making their surfaces conditioned to do things that the whole bar won't do. It becomes advantageous many times to have a bar or a tool that has a tough, ductile interior, but a hard, very resilient exterior. So we won't break the tool very easily if we are going to be subjecting it to high stress. It will give, it will bend a little bit, it will absorb a lot of energy before it will rupture, but at the same time, the attrition wear on the surface of the material will be very small. Well, we treat the surfaces of the material in many different ways. One of the ways that we treat the surface of the material is to try to prevent something that's called fatigue, which we will cover in the last lesson. But I just want to mention here that in surface treatment, we treat the material to prevent it from fatiguing by causing the outer surface of the material, of the piece of steel, to be in compressive stress, under compressive stresses. So if you can visualize that if you took a piece of steel and you hit it with a ball-peen hammer, say a rounded sphere, you'd put a little dimple in it like a Bernal impression. What you're really doing is putting the material under compression. It relaxes elastically, but it leaves a compressive stress in the material. If you peen the entire surface, what you're trying to do is jam the material closer together so it's all in a compressive stress mode. If we now bend that bar so that the side that we have just peened is the tensile side of the beam that's being bent, we find that before we can load it in a tensile stress to cause it to crack, it's got to unload the compressive stress that we hammered into it. And so there's an operation known as peening or blasting, shot peening, the surface of a shaft or many of the devices we have, which are a surface treatment that is a mechanical surface treatment. Doesn't have to do with heat treatment per se, but will give us a hardened surface. That is to say, we are plastically deforming the surface to produce that particular stress. And it says that the values, all the values that we've looked at in, say, strain hardening will still exist just in the surface of that material, and the interior would still be the tough, soft material that we liked. So that's one way we can prepare a surface. But there's a heat treatment way to prepare surfaces that we look at, and there are many, many avenues to heat treating the surface. And I'd like to first of all sort of just globally describe what you're trying to do and look at the different methods of doing it. And then we'll look at some characteristic properties of the material under that heat treatment procedure, or under that surface treatment procedure. In order to do this, what you have to do now is remember that we have a structure that's crystalline. In materials like iron are going to be either body-centered cubic or face-centered cubic. And we have the capability of putting all sorts of other materials with it as atoms to add to it. If we add an atom of any extraneous material to the iron, it can position itself in one of two ways. It can replace an iron atom at a lattice site. So we no longer have just iron in the unit cell, but we will have one atom of some strange material in every unit cell. In some structures, other than the iron structures, we can always cause that extraneous atom or the alloying atom to sit in exactly the same position in the lattice, and we call that an ordered structure. Whereas if it sits in a position substitutionally at random, we say it's not ordered, or it's a disordered structure. Generally, when we add atoms of material to iron, we do not get ordered structures. We can get intermetallic compounds that are ordered in iron, but most of the time we don't. We can also have atoms that we add to the material, to the structure, that are so small that they don't substitute for the atom in the unit cell. What they really do is they position themselves interstitially in the lattice, in the unit cell. That is between the atoms. And so, for instance, a hydrogen atom, not a hydrogen molecule now, a hydrogen atom is small enough to slip right through the total lattice of a piece of steel. It could just go through like it was almost uninhibited, travel through, diffuse through the steel. There are other things that will do this, and one of them that will do this is carbon. When you add the carbon to the steel and it was molten, started to solidify, if it came out as Fe3C in the solid state, then it's tied up in that compound. But if we have carbon in, say, austenite, then we have a carbon atom that's sitting in the lattice and can move around wherever it wants to go. And in the lesson that we just completed, where we did heat treatment, what we really were doing was taking the carbon atoms, let's say for 35 carbon steel, a 0.35 carbon steel, We're taking the carbon atoms that are in the face-centered cubic lattice. We're trying to collapse the lattice, squeeze it down to a body-centered cubic lattice, and the carbon is in the way. It doesn't have time, if you take it out of equilibrium, to diffuse to form Fe3C. So it gets trapped, and it prevents the lattice from going to the body-centered cubic form, and so in reality, martensite is a body-centered tetragonal structure. It's a distorted structure. It's a structure under a high-stress configuration. So we find that the carbon can run in and out of the steel. The rapidity with which it runs in and out of the steel is directly a function of temperature and time. So if I have a low-carbon steel, let's say just a 1010 steel, and I would like to make the surface of this steel a high-carbon steel, then I could put it in some sort of a carbonaceous atmosphere, an excess of carbon, so the carbon will tend to flow into the piece of steel. If, on the other hand, I had a piece of 1090 steel and I put it in the furnace in an oxidizing atmosphere, the carbon flows out of this steel, and you get a decarburized surface. So we can cause it to flow in and out at will. If we do this, and we took a very low carbon steel, incapable of being heat treated, let's say, because we don't have enough carbon to prevent the collapse to give us the martensite, even though we went to high quench rates, we could put a material on the surface, let's say a high carbon layer, that we could heat treat and make the material very, very hard. On the other hand, we could do a surface preparation that's equivalently as good. If we have a material that can be heat treated, we have devices where we can heat the surface of the material very, very rapidly before we ever heat up the inside of the material. You saw in the demonstrations in heat treatment how quickly the material changed. It takes almost no time to heat it up to get the carbon to go into the austenitic form, and takes almost no time to trap it as martensite. Seconds, fractions of seconds.